In the middle of a deadly snowstorm, a retired Navy SEAL sees a young woman dragging a suitcase through the freezing night. One step slower, and she would have collapsed into the snow forever. He should have kept driving. Every instinct from war told him to. But his loyal German shepherd refused to look away, and that hesitation changed everything. She had lost her child, lost her marriage, walked away with nothing but a broken suitcase and a heart too tired to hope. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter pressed down on Spokane like a held breath. Snow, wind, and silence weaving a white corridor where roads forgot their names. James Walker drove without destination, which was how most of his nights had looked since retirement. The dashboard clock glowed a dull blue, ticking forward with an indifference he both envied and resented. 45 years old, retired Navy SEAL, medically cleared, honorably discharged, labels that fit neatly on paper, but never explained why silence still felt louder than gunfire. The truck's tires hummed against packed snow. Each rotation felt deliberate, controlled, the way he had learned to move through danger, steady, never rushed. He kept the radio off. Music invited memory, and memory invited questions. Tonight, he wanted neither. Beside him sat Rex. Rex did not sleep. He rarely did on drives like this. His presence was calm but coiled, as if the road itself were something that needed watching. James trusted that awareness more than his own thoughts. Rex had carried him through places where hesitation meant death, and through years afterward when hesitation meant something worse, living. James flexed his hands on the steering wheel. They still tightened the way they had around a rifle, even though the weapon was long gone. Habit, not need. The war taught him that muscle remembered things the mind tried to bury. He told himself he was just driving, burning fuel, letting time pass. But part of him knew that nights like this were patrols, old instincts wearing civilian clothes. Snow thickened as the truck climbed a shallow incline toward the outskirts of the city. Streetlights thinned, buildings gave way to pines and half-forgotten service roads. The world narrowed to headlights and white blur. Rex shifted. It was subtle, a change in posture more than movement. James noticed anyway. He always did. "What is it?" he murmured, though he already felt it. The faint tightening in his chest, the quiet alert that rose before conscious thought. Rex's focus sharpened, gaze fixed ahead, ears forward. Not aggressive, not alarmed, intent. James eased off the accelerator. At first there was nothing, just snow folding over itself, wind drawing invisible lines across the road. Then the headlights caught something darker, a shape where there shouldn't be one, a figure. James's breath stalled. He leaned forward, squinting through the glass. The shape resolved into a woman, walking against the storm with the stubbornness of someone who had already decided that stopping was not an option. She dragged a suitcase behind her. It bounced awkwardly, one wheel catching, the handle jerking in her grip. She staggered. Rex let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl. A warning without violence. James's first instinct was to keep driving. He hated that about himself, but he didn't deny it. The world he came from had taught him that strangers in the dark were variables, and variables got people killed. He had learned caution the hard way, learned how easily compassion could be used as bait. He told himself she could be anyone. He told himself the storm made people look worse than they were. He told himself that the city was only a few miles back. Then the woman's knees buckled. She caught herself on the suitcase, breathing hard, head bowed, as if the weight of the night had finally pressed too much. Snow gathered in her hair, clung to the shoulders of her coat. She didn't look toward the truck. She didn't wave. She just stood there, swaying. James felt the familiar pull inside him, the old argument between instinct and conscience. The part of him that had survived war whispered caution. The part of him that had survived afterward whispered something quieter and harder to ignore. Rex turned his head and looked at him. There was no command in the dog's eyes, no demand, just certainty. "Damn it," James breathed. He braked. The truck slid slightly before stopping. James swore under his breath, heart ticking faster, not fear exactly, but the sharp readiness that never fully left him. He watched the woman through the windshield for a long second, cataloging movement, distance, the angle of her body. She looked back then, startled by the sudden wash of light. Her face was pale, younger than he'd expected, tired in a way that went deeper than cold. James rolled down the window halfway. The wind cut in immediately, biting and loud. "Ma'am," he called, "you can't be out here." The woman opened her mouth. The storm stole her words. She tried again, shaking her head, gesturing weakly as if to say she was fine, that she would keep moving. Rex shifted, a quiet whine rising in his throat. James closed his eyes briefly. He knew that sound. It wasn't fear. It was insistence. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm. Cold slammed into him, sharp and immediate. His boots sank into the snow as he approached, keeping his hands visible, his movements unhurried. He stopped a few feet away. "You're freezing," he said. Calm, even. The way he spoke to civilians in disaster zones when panic made words brittle. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice shook despite the claim. "I just need to keep going." "Where to?" She hesitated. "Does it matter?" It did. He didn't say that. Instead, he nodded once. "You'll last maybe another mile in this. 2, if you're lucky." A humorless smile flickered across her face. "I've never been very lucky." She was dragging the suitcase again, stubborn as gravity. James noticed how light it seemed when it bumped against the snow. Not much inside, or nothing worth carrying. "What's your name?" he asked. "Anna," she said after a beat. "Anna Miller." He gave his own, no rank, no past, just a name. He gestured toward the truck. "Get in, warm up." She shook her head immediately. "I can't." "Why not?" She glanced at the passenger seat, then at Rex, who stood watching her with a stillness that felt deliberate. "I don't have money." James exhaled slowly. "I'm not charging." Silence stretched between them, filled by wind. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the years of learning not to accept help, the fear of owing something she couldn't repay. Rex stepped closer, placing himself at her side, not touching, simply present. Anna froze, then relaxed slightly, as if some internal line had eased. James waited. He'd learned patience in places where forcing a decision only made it break. Finally, Anna nodded once. The ride back into the truck felt like crossing a threshold. The door closed, cutting off the storm's roar. Warm air filled the cab. Anna clutched her suitcase in her lap, knuckles white. Rex settled at her feet, facing forward again, his job done for now. James pulled back onto the road, hands steady, heart still working through the echo of the choice he'd made. He didn't know where this would lead. He only knew that he hadn't driven past. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like the right kind of trouble. Snow thinned into a bitter haze as Spokane's outskirts slid past the windshield, the storm easing just enough to let the road pretend it still belonged to someone. James drove with both hands on the wheel, feeling the quiet thrum of the engine settle into his bones. The truck smelled faintly of cold fabric and old coffee, a familiar, grounding scent. He kept his eyes forward, not because the road demanded it, but because looking at the passenger seat felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. Anna sat rigidly beside him, the suitcase upright between her knees, as if it were a shield. Rex stayed low and still near her feet, alert without tension, a presence that filled the space without demanding it. James noticed how the storm's noise softened once the doors had closed, how silence returned in a different shape, less hostile, more watchful. He told himself it was just the weather changing, but he knew better. Silence always changed when people entered it. He felt the old pull to retreat inward, to build distance before expectation could take root. Since retirement, that instinct had kept him safe. Safe from disappointment, from questions, from the weight of other people's stories attaching themselves to his own. He had learned painfully that listening could reopen doors he'd spent years barricading. Yet here he was, driving a stranger through the night, because he hadn't been able to ignore the way she had nearly fallen, because Rex had chosen to stand beside her, because something inside James had flinched at the idea of leaving her there. He remembered other nights, other roads, when stopping had meant death, when the wrong choice had followed him home in the form of names carved into stone. The war had trained him to calculate risk in seconds, to rank lives by proximity and mission. Civilian life offered no such clarity. The risks were quieter, the consequences slower, but they lingered longer. Anna shifted, breaking the rhythm of his thoughts. "You don't have to take me far," she said, her voice careful, as if each word were being tested before release. "Just somewhere I can warm up." James nodded without looking at her. "We'll find something." The words came easily, but they felt heavier than they should have. Somewhere implied choice, responsibility. He caught himself glancing at Rex in the rearview mirror, not for reassurance, but for confirmation. The dog met his gaze briefly, calm and steady, then returned his attention to the road ahead. That was how it had always been between them. Rex did not judge James's decisions. He trusted them until there was reason not to. James wondered when that trust had become harder to accept than suspicion. He adjusted the heater, listening to the fan struggle against the cold, and felt a flicker of irritation at the small human fragility of machines. In the teams, things either worked or they didn't. Failure was immediate. Here, failure crept in gradually, disguised as inconvenience. Anna rubbed her hands together, then stopped, as if embarrassed by the need. James reached into the console and pulled out a pair of gloves he kept there out of habit, handing them over without ceremony. She hesitated, then took them, murmuring thanks that carried more relief than gratitude. The word lodged somewhere uncomfortable in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. Just manners. The road curved toward a strip of low buildings, lights dim and widely spaced, the kind of place that existed because people needed to pass through it, not because anyone wanted to stay. James recognized the outline of a late-night diner ahead, its sign flickering stubbornly against the dark. He felt a small, irrational tightening in his gut. Diners were places of pause, of questions asked and answered under fluorescent lights. They were places where people talked. He slowed anyway. Rex lifted his head slightly, sensing the change. Anna noticed the lights too, her posture easing just a fraction. "I can wait here," she said quickly, as if worried she'd already asked for too much. James shook his head. "You shouldn't." He pulled into the lot, tires crunching over ice. The truck idled, breath steaming in the cold. For a moment no one moved. James realized he was stalling. Going inside meant committing to the choice he'd made back on the road. It meant warmth, food, witnesses. It meant this wasn't just a momentary act of decency he could compartmentalize and move past. Rex shifted again, a quiet reminder that waiting too long could become its own kind of failure. James cut the engine and opened his door. Cold rushed in, sharp and clean. He stepped out, circling to the passenger side. Anna watched him through the glass, uncertainty etched across her face. When he opened the door, she flinched slightly, then caught herself, lifting her chin in a gesture that spoke of pride more than defiance. James offered a hand. She studied it for a second before taking it, her grip light but steady. Rex followed them out, positioning himself between them and the empty lot. Not out of aggression, but habit, his instincts mapping threats James no longer consciously tracked. Inside, the diner smelled of grease and coffee and something faintly sweet. A woman behind the counter looked up, her expression tired but not unkind, and nodded them toward an open booth. James felt the weight of being seen settle on his shoulders. He guided Anna to the seat, then slid in across from her, Rex settling beneath the table with a soft exhale. As they waited, James became acutely aware of his own stillness, of how carefully he held himself when there were civilians around, as if sudden movement might betray something dangerous. He watched Anna cradle her mug once it arrived, steam fogging her glasses, color slowly returning to her face. He told himself he wouldn't ask questions. He told himself he would finish the coffee, pay, and then decide what came next. But as the storm continued to hiss against the windows, as Rex relaxed into the simple rhythm of safety, James felt a quiet certainty forming beneath his reluctance. The road ahead was still blocked by weather, and whatever choice he made after this would not be as simple as dropping her off and driving away. A realization that settled over him as he glanced back toward the door and noticed the snow beginning to fall harder again. Night pressed closer around the diner, the windows frosting at the edges as the storm gathered itself for another push, Spokane fading into a blur of white and yellow light beyond the glass. James sat across from Anna, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't tasted yet, watching steam curl upward and disappear. He told himself the pause was practical, that waiting out the weather was common sense, but the truth was quieter and harder to admit. Stopping meant listening. Listening meant allowing another story to exist beside his own. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping his inner world sealed, each memory filed away like ordnance, labeled and never touched. The diner felt like a breach in that system, a place where silence softened and demanded exchange. Rex shifted under the table, settling into a posture that suggested temporary safety, not surrender. James read that nuance easily. The dog trusted this space for now, but not enough to sleep deeply. James felt the same. The waitress returned with plates and refilled coffee without asking. Her name tag read Nancy, a small human detail James filed away without meaning to. She glanced once at Anna's red hands, once at James's face, then said nothing. He appreciated that more than words. Anna ate slowly, as if afraid the food might vanish if she rushed it. James watched her out of habit, the way he'd once watched teammates after long missions, checking for signs of shock, collapse, anything he might need to respond to. He caught himself and looked away, irritated at the reflex. She wasn't his responsibility, except that somehow she was. The thought tightened something in his chest. "You don't have to stay," Anna said quietly, eyes on her plate. "Once the storm eases, I can keep going." James studied the way she held herself, the careful balance between asking and refusing. "Where were you headed?" he asked, more gently than he'd intended. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Maple Creek, or close to it." The vagueness told him more than a detailed answer would have. He nodded once. "That road's usually bad in weather like this." As if summoned by the words, the diner door opened, letting in a rush of wind and snow. A man stepped inside, stamping his boots, muttering about closures and plows turning back. The fragments of conversation drifted through the room. Road shut, visibility gone, maybe till morning. James felt the decision forming before he consciously accepted it. He'd learned long ago that some choices announce themselves by removing alternatives. Anna's shoulders stiffened as she listened. "I didn't think it would be this bad," she said, almost to herself. James took a sip of coffee then, letting the bitterness anchor him. "Weather doesn't care what we think." She smiled faintly at that, then looked down again. Silence returned, thicker now, weighted with things unsaid. James could leave it there. He was good at that. But something about the way she gripped the mug, like it was the last stable thing in her world, nudged him forward. "You said you work as a server," he said. "Yeah." "Why the suitcase?" The question landed heavier than he'd meant. Anna inhaled slowly, then exhaled, as if bracing against an internal wind. "Because I left," she said, "and because I didn't know where else to put the leaving." James stayed quiet. He had learned that silence, used correctly, could be an invitation rather than a wall. "I had a family," she continued, words careful, measured. "A little girl." Her voice wavered just enough to register the depth beneath it. James felt a familiar hollow open in his chest, the echo of names he never spoke. "She's gone," Anna said. No details, none needed. The space around the sentence carried its own weight. After that, nothing stayed where it was supposed to. My husband Mark, he tried to hold it together. Then he didn't. Drinking started as a way to sleep. Then it became the only way he could stand being awake. She paused, jaw tightening. "I stayed longer than I should have. People always say that." James thought of his own lingering years after the war, of nights spent staring at walls, because moving on felt like betrayal. He didn't interrupt. "Eventually I realized I was shrinking," Anna said. "Not because he was cruel, because grief can rot a place without anyone noticing. So I left. I didn't take anything I couldn't carry." She gestured toward the suitcase, a small, almost apologetic motion. James felt a flicker of anger then, not at her, but at the quiet unfairness of it. He pushed it down. Anger was easy. Presence was harder. Rex shifted again, nudging Anna's ankle lightly, then resting his chin near her foot. Anna stilled, then reached down, fingers brushing his head. The contact grounded her. James could see it. The dog's loyalty wasn't loud. It was steady, earned in places where survival depended on reading pain without language. Nancy returned, setting down the check and glancing toward the windows. "Storm's getting worse," she said. "County just called it. They're closing the pass." James nodded, already calculating distances. Driving further tonight would be reckless. Leaving Anna to fend for herself was unthinkable now, even if he pretended otherwise. He reached for his wallet, sliding a few bills onto the table. Nancy pushed them back slightly. "You can get me later," she said. "Just make sure you get somewhere warm." James met her eyes, surprised by the firmness there. He inclined his head in thanks. Outside, snow fell harder, thicker, swallowing sound. James stood, feeling the weight of the next choice settle fully onto his shoulders. "I have a place," he said, turning to Anna. The words felt strange, as if spoken by someone else. "It's not in the city, a cabin, old, but it's solid." Anna looked at him, uncertainty and relief colliding in her expression. "I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't," he said, and realized he meant it. He didn't explain why. Some truths resisted explanation. They gathered their things. Rex rose immediately, alert but calm, ready to move when James moved. As they stepped back into the storm, James felt the past and present align in an uncomfortable way. He had once led people into danger because it was his job. Tonight, he was leading someone into shelter because he chose to. The difference mattered more than he expected. As the truck doors closed and the engine turned over, snow hammering the windshield, James glanced once toward the dark road ahead and knew that whatever waited at the cabin would not be just a roof and a fire, but something he hadn't faced in years. The possibility that letting someone stay might mean he could no longer pretend he was only passing through his own life. The cabin emerged from the trees like a held memory, its dark outline barely separating itself from the snow and pine, as the truck's headlights cut a narrow path into the clearing. James killed the engine and listened to the sudden quiet settle around them, heavier than the storm had been, as if the land itself were waiting to see what he would do next. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, feeling the echo of the drive in his arms, the familiar afterimage of movement that lingered whenever he stopped. Bringing someone here had not been part of any plan. He hadn't been up this road in years, not since the funeral, not since he'd locked the door and convinced himself that distance was the same as closure. Rex shifted first, muscles tightening, not with fear but attention, the kind that sharpened when a place remembered more than it showed. James opened his door and stepped out, cold biting immediately, clean and unforgiving. The air smelled of snow and old wood smoke, a scent that pulled at something low in his chest before he could stop it. He went around to help Anna out, steadying her elbow as her boots met uneven ground. She looked around quietly, taking in the cabin without comment, as if sensing that words would only disturb whatever balance existed here. James retrieved the key from where it had always been hidden, a small ritual unchanged by time, and unlocked the door. The hinges complained softly as it opened, releasing a breath of cold air trapped inside. James stepped in first, sweeping his gaze through the space on instinct, mapping corners, distances, the way light fell. The interior was exactly as he'd left it, and entirely different. Dust lay thinly over surfaces, the furniture holding its shape like paused figures. A pair of boots by the hearth caught his eye, his father's, still angled toward the fire, as if waiting for warmth that never came. He swallowed, feeling the familiar pressure behind his sternum, and moved aside to let Anna enter. She exhaled softly, a sound that carried relief and restraint in equal measure. James set about the basics automatically, stacking logs, striking a match, coaxing flame from wood that resisted at first and then surrendered. Firelight filled the room slowly, chasing shadows into corners, but not erasing them. Rex circled once, twice, nose low, tracking a story written in scent rather than sight. James watched him without comment, trusting the dog's reading more than his own memories. When Rex paused near the back wall, ears angling forward, James felt a flicker of unease. He didn't reach for a weapon, there wasn't one. Instead, he reached for the flashlight he kept clipped inside his jacket, a habit from another life. "Stay here," he said quietly to Anna, not as an order, but a reassurance. She nodded, moving closer to the fire, hands extended toward the growing warmth. James followed Rex down the short hallway, beam cutting across familiar doors, the light revealing nothing out of place, and yet too much of it at once. In the small bedroom, the bedspread lay rumpled, a detail that tightened his jaw. He hadn't slept here in years. He crouched, touching the fabric, cold, but recently disturbed. Rex sniffed, tail still, then moved on, drawn toward the back door. Outside, the porch boards creaked under James's weight, the snow uneven, marked. Footprints, not old enough to be dismissed, not fresh enough to be alarming. Human. One set, leading away toward the trees. James straightened slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the beam's reach, feeling the old readiness hum beneath his skin. Whoever it had been, they were gone, for now. He exhaled, forcing his shoulders to lower, and led Rex back inside, closing the door carefully behind them. Anna looked up from the hearth, reading his face with more accuracy than he liked. "Someone was here," she said, not a question. "Maybe," he replied. He didn't elaborate. He set her suitcase near the table, noting again how light it felt, how little it carried for a life so heavy. As the fire took hold, warmth spread, slow but persistent. Anna began to help without being asked, arranging chairs closer to the heat, stacking kindling with practiced efficiency. James noticed the way she moved, the quiet competence of someone used to making do. It unsettled him in an unexpected way. He had brought her here to offer shelter, but already the space was changing, responding to her presence as much as his. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, Rex settling near James's feet, still alert, one ear turned toward the back of the cabin. James leaned back against the wall, eyes on the flames, feeling memories stir and recede. He thought of his father building this place with hands that knew discipline and patience, of the way the man had chosen isolation, not as punishment, but as refuge. James had inherited that instinct whole. Tonight, it felt less certain. "You didn't have to bring me here," Anna said softly. James shook his head. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows, testing the seams. Rex lifted his head, growling low, not in warning, but acknowledgement. James met the sound with a steady hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding both of them. Somewhere beyond the firelight, the cabin creaked, settling into its new occupants, and James realized that this place he had avoided for years was no longer empty, and that whatever had passed through before them had left questions he would need to answer sooner rather than later. Morning arrived reluctantly, gray light filtering through frost-rimmed windows as the storm loosened its grip, but refused to fully leave the hills outside Spokane. James woke before the fire had burned down to embers, the cold seeping back into the room in thin, persistent fingers. He lay still for a moment, listening, letting the cabin announce itself the way unfamiliar terrain once had overseas. The wind moved along the eaves. Wood shifted. Rex's breathing marked time near his feet, steady but not deep. Alert even in rest. James recognized that state. It was the same half-sleep he'd learned in places where safety was temporary and dawn did not mean relief. He rose quietly, adding a log to the hearth, watching flame reclaim the room inch by inch. Anna slept in the chair near the fire, her posture guarded even in rest, one arm looped around the suitcase handle as if it might vanish if she let go. The sight stirred something complicated in him. He had brought her here to offer shelter, yet she still slept like someone prepared to be told to leave. He turned away before the thought could root. Outside, the snow had softened, the air holding that fragile calm that followed a long night of resistance. James stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line where he'd found the footprints. They were still there, dulled by fresh snow but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. The logical part of him listed possibilities: hunter, drifter, someone caught out by weather. The part shaped by experience cataloged angles, cover, approach routes. He hated that both voices spoke with equal clarity. Rex joined him, standing at his side, gaze tracking the same line James watched. The dog's internal calculus mirrored his own, assessing without panic, loyalty bound to vigilance. James exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the present. This wasn't a hostile zone. Not yet. When they returned inside, Anna was awake, sitting upright, eyes following him with quiet concern. He gave a small nod. "Coffee?" he asked. She smiled faintly, relief flickering through the exhaustion. They moved through the morning without ceremony. Anna helped where she could, arranging the space with instinctive efficiency, as if order itself were a way to earn permission to stay. James noticed and said nothing. Saying something might turn it into a debt. He stepped back outside to check the shed, Rex moving ahead, nose low. The door creaked open easily, too easily. Inside, the cold was sharper, the space holding the stale scent of damp wood and something else, human and recent. James's pulse quickened, not with fear, but readiness. "Come out," he called, voice level, the way he'd been trained to speak when escalation was a choice rather than a reaction. Silence answered first, then movement. A man emerged slowly, hands raised, eyes blinking against the light. He looked worn more than dangerous, the kind of wear that came from years of losing ground rather than fighting. "Didn't mean any trouble," the man said. "Just needed a place till the storm passed." James studied him, reading posture, tone, the absence of aggression. Rex stepped between them, not growling, simply present, a line drawn without hostility. James felt the familiar conflict flare. Trust had once been a luxury he couldn't afford. Now it felt like a risk he'd been avoiding rather than evaluating. "Name?" James asked. "Caleb," the man replied. "Caleb Morgan." The name meant nothing, which in this case mattered. James nodded once. "You can't stay in the shed." Caleb's shoulders sagged, resignation setting in faster than protest. "I'll move on," he said. "Didn't know anyone was here." Before James could respond, Anna appeared in the doorway of the cabin. She took in the scene in a single glance and spoke without hesitation. "He'll freeze if he leaves now." Her voice was calm, firm, carrying a certainty James hadn't heard from her before. He turned toward her, surprised not by the words but by the resolve behind them. She met his gaze steadily. In that moment, James understood something he'd learned too late in other contexts. Survival did not always look like retreat. Sometimes it looked like opening the door wider. Rex remained still, no warning in him, no challenge. The dog's judgment weighed heavily. James sighed, the sound carrying years of learned restraint. "One night," he said to Caleb, "by the fire. Then we figure it out." Caleb nodded quickly, gratitude flashing across his face before he reined it in, as if afraid to show too much. Inside, the dynamic shifted subtly, the cabin accommodating another presence without complaint. Caleb sat near the hearth, warming his hands, eyes half closed in relief. James watched him from the periphery, alert to any sign of deception, but found only exhaustion. Over simple food and reheated coffee, conversation unfolded cautiously. Caleb spoke of work that had dried up, of moving town to town, chasing the promise of a restart that never quite arrived. James listened, recognizing the pattern of a man defined by what he used to be. When the talk turned quiet, James surprised himself by speaking of his own ghosts, not in detail, but enough to acknowledge their weight. Anna listened without interruption, her presence grounding rather than probing. Rex shifted between them, the silent arbiter of comfort, leaning briefly against James's leg before settling near Anna again, as if to remind them both that vigilance and compassion were not opposites. As the day wore on, the cabin warmed, not just from the fire, but from activity. Caleb fixed a loose hinge without being asked. Anna cleaned the small kitchen area with deliberate care. James repaired a warped window frame, hands moving with focus that felt almost meditative. He realized with a start that this was the first time in years he'd worked alongside others without hierarchy, without orders. The absence of command was unsettling and liberating in equal measure. When evening crept back in, the wind picking up once more, James stood by the window, watching snow drift across the clearing. He felt the weight of responsibility settle fully now. He had invited two strangers into a place he'd treated like a sealed chapter of his life. Whatever happened next would not be neutral. Rex came to stand beside him, pressing lightly against his knee. James rested a hand there, drawing strength from the familiar steadiness. Outside, the footprints near the trees had softened further, nearly erased, but the sense that this night was a threshold remained, and James knew that the choices he was making here, quietly and without witness, were reshaping something he had once believed was finished. Winter loosened its hold without surrender, the days lengthening by minutes, as pale light spread across the ridge and revealed a world reshaped by thawing snow and quiet persistence. James discovered that time behaved differently when he stopped measuring it against what he had lost. Morning routines formed without discussion, fire first, then coffee, then work. Not work as he had known it in uniform, with orders and objectives and consequences written in ink and blood, but work that asked for patience rather than precision, attention rather than urgency. He found himself waking with purpose that did not come from duty, and the realization unsettled him more than emptiness ever had. The cabin, once a sealed container of memory, responded to use. Hinges stopped complaining. Drafts were chased from corners. The place did not resist being lived in. It had only been waiting. James noticed how his hands moved when he repaired things alongside Caleb, the old muscle memory translating easily into sanding, measuring, aligning. There was comfort in the repetition, in the way progress could be seen and touched. In another life, success had been counted in completed missions and survival. Here it appeared as a straightened window frame, a door that closed properly. Anna moved through the space with quiet intention, keeping order without announcing it, cooking with what they had, making lists that did not feel like plans so much as promises. James watched her from the periphery, aware of the steadiness she brought, the way her presence anchored the days without demanding explanation. He recognized the pattern from teams he'd trusted most: competence without ego, care without spectacle. Rex adapted as if this configuration had always been inevitable. He monitored the perimeter when the wind picked up, positioned himself near whichever person was most unsettled at any given moment, and relaxed fully only when James did. The dog's internal compass had been shaped by conflict, but it pointed now toward continuity rather than threat. James found himself listening to that shift, letting it inform his own. The workshop door had remained closed since his father's death, a boundary James had never questioned until now. When he finally opened it, the smell of old wood and oil rushed out, carrying memories he had not prepared for. Tools lay where they'd been left, projects half finished, the past preserved not out of reverence, but neglect. Caleb stepped inside behind him, his posture changing immediately, shoulders easing, as if the room itself spoke a language he understood fluently. James watched him move among the benches with a familiarity that bordered on reverence, fingers tracing edges, eyes assessing potential rather than decay. It struck James that grief could hollow out a space, but skill could fill it again. They began with small things, cleaning, organizing, bringing order back piece by piece. James learned to accept instruction without bristling, to follow rather than lead, an unfamiliar relief settling in as he surrendered control. Anna joined them with supplies and quiet encouragement, turning the workshop into a place of shared effort rather than solitary reflection. Hours passed unnoticed, the sounds of work layered together, rhythmic and grounding. James felt something inside him loosen, the constant vigilance easing into something like attention. He realized that for years he had mistaken stillness for safety, isolation for strength. Here, surrounded by purposeful motion and uncomplicated company, his thoughts no longer circled the same scars. They widened. When they repaired an old chair that had belonged to his father, James felt the weight of inheritance shift. The chair did not demand reverence, it demanded use. Sitting in it later, feeling the wood support him without judgment, James understood that legacy was not something to be preserved untouched, but something to be carried forward, adapted, allowed to age alongside those who needed it. Evenings grew longer. Conversation came more easily, stories shared without probing, grief acknowledged without ceremony. Caleb spoke of loss without dramatics. Anna listened with empathy shaped by her own history, and James contributed when words felt necessary rather than expected. Rex anchored these exchanges, a constant reminder that loyalty was not about possession, but presence. James noticed that when he lay down at night, his body rested more fully, the half-sleep of vigilance giving way to something deeper. The change frightened him slightly. Rest had always felt temporary, something to be rationed. Now it arrived unannounced, undeserved, and he did not know how long it would stay. As the days edged toward a fragile calm, James became aware of a new responsibility forming, not imposed from outside, but grown from within. He had opened a door, not just to his cabin, but to the possibility that this place could be more than a refuge from weather. The thought carried weight. Commitment always did. Rex sensed the shift before James named it, watching him with quiet intensity, as if waiting for confirmation that this new direction would be defended with the same resolve as old ones. James stood one evening at the edge of the clearing, surveying the softened landscape, and felt the pull of something unfinished. The world beyond the trees still existed, with its demands and histories, and he knew that what they were building here would soon be tested. The knowledge did not send him retreating. Instead, it steadied him. He returned to the cabin, closing the door against the cold, aware that the next chapter of this uneasy peace would require choices that could not be sanded smooth, choices that would ask him to stand rather than hide. Late winter sunlight thinned across the ridge, the snow receding in uneven patches as Spokane breathed out a cautious calm that followed storms rather than erased them. James heard the car before he saw it, the crunch of tires on thawing gravel, slicing through the workshop's steady rhythm, and the sound reached a place in him that still measured danger by noise rather than sight. Rex's posture changed instantly, not alarmed but precise, the kind of readiness that had been forged by long hours of guarding quiet spaces where the wrong interruption could cost everything. James set his tools down and stepped outside, the air sharp but no longer punishing, and watched a dark sedan ease into the clearing and stop as if unsure it belonged there. He felt the familiar cataloging begin, distances and lines and the weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders, yet something else held him in place now, something anchored by the life he had allowed to take root here. The driver's door opened and a man got out, movements uneven, resolve stitched together by resentment and fatigue rather than intention. Anna came to James's side without being called, her stillness a tell he had learned to read over the past days, and he understood before she spoke that this was Mark, the past arriving without invitation, carried by loss that had never learned how to rest. Mark's eyes moved quickly, skimming the cabin, the workshop, Rex, and finally James, as if searching for a story that would justify his own. He spoke with the brittle certainty of someone who needed to be right, because being wrong would mean facing what he had become, and Anna listened without flinching, the way people do when they have already decided not to be pulled backward by familiar gravity. James stayed quiet, letting the moment find its own shape, resisting the impulse to command or correct, aware that stepping forward too soon would steal something Anna had earned. Rex stood between them, not threatening, simply present, the quiet declaration of a boundary that did not require teeth. Mark laughed once, a short sound that carried the weight of nights he had not survived cleanly, and accused Anna of running, of hiding, of replacing what had been lost, and the words fell flat against the steadiness she had found here. She answered without raising her voice, without apology, saying she had left because staying had turned grief into a room with no doors, and James felt a subtle shift in himself at the clarity of it, recognizing the same choice he had made when he stopped driving past what needed him. Mark reached for his phone, fingers clumsy, and James noticed the signs he had learned to read in other contexts, the slowed reactions, the dull edge that made risk feel invisible to the person carrying it. He did not move until Rex adjusted his stance, a fraction closer to Anna, and James placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding both of them, as the call went through and ended in raised voices carried away by the thinning wind. When the sheriff's vehicle climbed the ridge a short while later, its presence felt procedural rather than dramatic, the law arriving not as judgment but as gravity. And James spoke plainly when asked, offering facts without embellishment, while Anna stated her choice clearly when it mattered, her yes steady and unqualified. Mark protested, the anger breaking into something like pleading when it became clear the night would not bend to him, and James watched without satisfaction as the officers took the steps required by a situation shaped by grief and poor decisions rather than malice. When the cars disappeared down the road, the quiet returned, altered but intact, and Anna's shoulders shook once as the last tension left her body, a release James recognized from men who had finally stood down after too long at the edge. Rex pressed close to her leg, the simple weight of presence offering what words could not, and James understood that loyalty was not about choosing sides, but about holding ground until others could stand on it themselves. They went back inside together, the cabin accepting the moment without commentary, and the evening unfolded in ordinary tasks that felt newly significant, Food warmed and tools set away, the workbench cleared not as an ending, but as a declaration that nothing here needed to be hidden anymore. As dusk settled, James stood at the window and watched the ridge darken, the snow reflecting the last light in a way that felt less like erasure and more like renewal. And he thought about the man he had been when he first came here, carrying silence like armor, convinced that staying unattached was the same as being free. He knew now that freedom was not the absence of ties, but the choice to tend them, to show up when showing up mattered, and to remain when leaving would be easier. Anna joined him, her presence easy, and for the first time he did not brace against what that closeness might demand later, because the demand had already been met in smaller, steadier ways. Rex settled near the hearth, the low sound of contentment marking the end of vigilance, and James felt a quiet completeness take shape. Not the dramatic closure of victory or absolution, but the earned calm of a place that had learned to hold what came to it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees without urgency, and inside, the life they had built did not ask to be named, to be real. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a car that stops in a snowstorm, a door that opens when it would be easier to keep it closed, or a loyal dog who reminds a broken soul that they are not alone. God often works not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people choosing compassion when no one is watching. In our daily lives, we may not face blizzards or life-and-death moments, but we are given small chances every day to be kind, to listen, to help, to stay. And those choices, no matter how small they seem, can change a life, sometimes even our own. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your words matter more than you know. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and your family, protect you through every storm, and guide your steps toward warmth, purpose, and peace.